Hello, welcome to the Burda Festival podcast powered by Afikra. I'm your host, Mikey Muhanna. Today we have SEIF El Rashidi, who is the director of the Barakat Trust. This is a really fun conversation about history, heritage, preservation, Islamic art, architecture, and culture. I hope you enjoy the conversation. As always, feel free to go over to burda.ae for more information. And if you haven't listened to the whole series, go back and check them out. We've had a fantastic first season of this series. So go to afikra.com/podcasts and you can see all about the festival and this entire series. Thanks so much. Welcome back to another episode of the Burda Podcast. My name is Mikey Muhanna. With me, I'm joined by SEIF El Rashidi, who is the director of the Barakat Trust. SEIF is an architectural historian with 20 years of expertise working on heritage preservation and managing projects related to promoting public engagement with heritage and culture. SEIF has worked with multiple organizations all over, focused primarily on heritage. He studied city design and social science at the London School of Economics and has a history of art and architecture MA and economics BA from the American University of Cairo. He's a co-author with Sam Boker of The 10th Makers of Cairo, Egypt's Medieval and Modern Appliqué Craft that came out by AUC Press in 2018. SEIF, thank you so much for joining.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I look forward to it.
So I want to start with the most obvious question to me, at least, which is, how does somebody go from getting an economics BA to deciding they want to then study heritage preservation or work on heritage preservation? That I imagine that most people sitting next to you in biometrics, econometrics, way back when did not also find themselves in this field.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think actually many of the journeys to my economics lectures were spent looking out at beautiful buildings in Cairo and somewhat lamenting that they weren't as well preserved as they could be. And so for me, it was the discovery of, or the journey of going from not knowing to what I wanted to do to discovering what I really wanted to do. And I discovered that I had a passion for architecture, and I was particularly struck by old buildings and history, and felt that in countries like Egypt, where I grew up, there wasn't enough being done to protect and preserve what was valuable. So that's how I ended up on that path. And I remember when I started studying art history, my professor said, well, I don't care what your GPA is. If you don't have a remembering eye, go back to economics. To be a good art historian or a good architectural historian, your eye has to see things and remember them.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that you have to be able to distinguish, for example, if you've seen a window somewhere and then you see it 5 years later, something very similar, you think, oh, that's a very interesting connection between, say, a window or a ceiling I saw in the Mosque of Cordoba in Spain and the same thing in Durham in the north of England, which actually is a true example. That sometimes you find similarities and connections and you think, this can't be coincidence. There must have been an idea. There must have been a fashion. There must have been a group of workers traveling from Tabriz in Iran to Cairo. And I think the science and the study of art history and architectural history is about making visual connections and then thinking, how do these connections make sense and why are they the way they are? So it's a bit forensic, except that what you're looking at is buildings and art.
Yeah. Well, let's start with Cairo then, since that's the city that you grew up in. As you started studying this and as your eye sharpened, do you feel like you had to relearn your understanding of Cairo's history as you started to pay attention to the buildings and the sort of built up environment around you in a way that you hadn't paid attention to it prior?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up interested in old buildings in a very kind of vague sense, but I think relearn indicates that I knew something and I had to kind of rethink it. I think actually I didn't know much, but it was something that I grew increasingly interested in, partially, as I told you, because I felt that Cairo was changing, and often those changes from my point of view were bad because they didn't value the old, and they tended to celebrate new things at the expense of old ones. And for me, studying art and architectural history was a quest to understand and to learn in a way that would enable me to work in that field.
It's interesting. There's that sentence, I forget who gets attributed to, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? I feel like with architecture, especially in this part of the world, there is almost an illusion there are illusions that architecture around us present. Something may have been built in 1900 in the style of something that was 1700. And so there's all these illusions that are around us. What do you think people in, we'll stick with Cairo right now. What do you think some of the most longstanding misunderstandings of architecture in Cairo do you have to confront constantly?
Well, I think that, for example, today, when you look at schemes that are more consciously thinking, well, let's build things in the spirit of the past, I think that there's one wave which celebrates neoclassical architecture and columns, and in fact sees this as, what we should be building. But sometimes they don't realize that there are proportions and there are ways that you don't just do a column that's like long and thin or short and fat. That there's a whole, there are conventions and proportions, and it's a whole study that produces this beautiful, elegant neoclassical architecture. And often those things are overlooked. That's one thing. The other thing is, with respect to the more historic areas of a city like Cairo, the medieval quarters, there's often the myth that comes more out of a storybook than out of reality, that every window was turned wood, mashrabiyya, and stalactites, muqarnas. And actually, I think in cities like Cairo and other places, they're actually the synthesis of many different ideas, many different periods, many different movements, and that just choosing one period of history and saying, oh, this is it, this is what Cairo looked like in its heyday is false. It was always the product of many different times and many ideas. And I suppose the misunderstanding is that it's much more than just a sterile city built at a moment. I remember once going to Barcelona, and on this public square was a tribute to an architect who had worked in Barcelona in the early 20th century, who had said that the image of a city is the work of time more than the work of an architect.
Interesting. So I want to shift a little bit to the organization that you direct, the Barakat Trust. And I'm going to read the mission, or sort of the tagline, which is supporting and promoting the study and preservation of Islamic art, heritage, architecture, and culture for future generations. And I want to zoom in on a couple words in this sentence. Where does preservation end and nostalgia begin?
That's a good question, but a very difficult one.
Yeah.
I think that preservation perhaps recognizes more realities than nostalgia. Nostalgia sees the past through rose-colored spectacles, that everything was good. Whereas preservation realizes that there are also modest buildings and mistakes of the past, and that you're not necessarily saving things simply because they are beautiful, but because they are important and they tell you something. So workers' housing is something that is worth preserving, even though nostalgia might choose to remember palaces and decorated ceilings, and imagine that the past was a romantic place of everyone living comfortably. And I think preservation seeks to take the past into the future, even if that past is not necessarily about comfortable, happy people and beautiful, intricate things.
Yeah. So preservation and progress are not antithetical.
No, not at all.
I think that is probably a conception, though, right? Especially when we think about, the work of, the UNESCO and other sort of preservation organizations that focus on preserving heritage. You can imagine that a bystander who's listening to some of the political debate or sort of policy debate saying, why should we preserve, in the case of workers' housing, why should we preserve this area that's all workers' housing? We want to build a skyscraper here. We want to build a new fill in the blank and progress forward. What is the more nuanced response to that hypothetical person I've created?
Well, I think the more nuanced response is to realize that you'll never get the past back again. And there's nothing to stop you from building skyscrapers if you want to, but it shouldn't be at the expense of historic building, with few exceptions, it shouldn't be at the expense of historic buildings that you're never going to get back. And I think that the past is fine. What has been produced by past civilizations is finite. I think that's the reality. And while we shouldn't stifle creativity, and we wouldn't be where we were today if people hadn't thought new thoughts and done new things, I think that it's recognized globally that the things that our ancestors did and our forefathers did are important and add value to the contemporary societies in which we live in today.
Yeah. Well, maybe you can give us a sense of what, on a sort of day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, year-to-year basis, the Barakat Trust does.
Okay.
Give us a broad overview.
So we were established over 35 years ago, recognizing a dearth in the number of people in the greater Islamic world, if you will, that had the skills and the interest and the knowledge to contribute to preserving their heritage. And often you found that the people that were most interested in preserving heritage were people who came to places like the Middle East and Iran and other areas, North Africa, as outsiders. And in order to preserve heritage, you have to have the skills to do it. It's not just the knowledge, but you need to have maintain the traditions of carpentry, for example, that enable you not only to produce a new thing, but to restore an old door or a window. And those skills were being lost rapidly because I think in the rush to progress and to be modern, old things were not seen as important. They were seen as archaic and old-fashioned and undesirable. And so the Barakat Trust was set up to enable people from countries like Lebanon and Egypt and India and other places to develop the skills, both by learning, by studying conservation or history of art and architecture, by traveling to attend conferences, to present at conferences, to go to workshops, by doing projects like exhibitions, like training of conservators, conservation projects, publications. So, one interesting thing about the Barakat Trust is that it recognizes that the practitioners, like the person that's going to restore a building or a ceiling or improve infrastructure, and scholarship and academics are intertwined, that you have to have both. You have to have the people who are going to get their hands dirty, and you have to have the people that will tell you that in 13th century Granada, textiles were woven a certain way. Because without those two aspects, you'll have huge gaps in your knowledge. And if you have those gaps, it's very difficult to preserve. And it's difficult also to continue to create things following on from old traditions.
What is the biggest challenge right now, having sort of set the table in that way? What is the biggest challenge for you and for the organization to continue to do its work for the next 35 years?
Well, the biggest challenge is that despite the number of heritage projects and heritage professionals increasing and the recognition that heritage is important, think of cities like Beirut, where in kind of a blast unexpectedly can destroy a huge area of the city. So I would say that if you take into account war, just general decline of old buildings, freak accidents, and the general lack of awareness, you realize that, so think of old buildings decline with time. And if you don't have maintenance, if you don't have awareness, the number of old buildings that requires preservation increases with time. And so I think the challenge is that for many heritage charities, the task is much bigger than the funds available. And I think it's taken for granted that governments have the means to preserve everything worth preserving in every country and every city. That's not true. That state budgets are never enough to do everything. Skills, the vast number of skills you need in every country with heritage is quite astounding. And so I would say that in a nutshell, the challenge is we're a small organization. We've had a long and deep and long-lasting impact, but the volume of work that needs to be done is great. The resources to do it are less great.
Let's say we take a look at all the different cities and sort of regions across the Islamic world. What place would you say is doing the best job? What is an exemplar that folks can look at and say, oh, they're doing it really well in Tunis. They're doing it really well in Alexandria. If you take a look at Amman, they might be doing it very well. Maybe somewhere in Indonesia. What's an example that we can point to?
Okay, well, I'll tell you two examples. I think Tunis is actually a good example because it has a very long history of preserving the Medina of Tunis, of recognizing that it's important and involving the local community in it, which is key. That if you don't involve local people and people that live in an area, you're not going to do that much in the long run. They've done it for decades. I would say a more recent example is Bahrain, Muharrak, where the government really put together an amazing program under the leadership of Sheikh Hamay al-Khalifa to invest in preserving old buildings and in thinking, well, how is this historic area, how can it really be revived? Thinking about practical things like parking and infrastructure and lighting and public space. And how can it not be gentrified? Meaning, oftentimes when places are improved, the original residents get displaced because they can no longer afford to live there. And I think that one of the good things about this project in Bahrain is that they recognize that the community is as important as the buildings and the spaces. They've done it over a long period. I would say that oftentimes when governments take an interest, they want to see results in a year or two.
Yeah.
And effective preservation is a long, thoughtful process. And I would say that Muharrak in Bahrain is an example of a government entity or a government project that realized that it's incremental change and incremental preservation, and that by doing it slowly and thoughtfully, it's much more sustainable.
What is give us a time scale? What is...
So they've been doing it for about 15 years, but I think the key is to realize that there are certain things you can accomplish in 6 months or a year, but if you try to do too much too quickly, the only way to do it is to do it superficially, and superficial things don't last.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question that may sound bizarre, but are there ever things that are there ever projects that were incorrectly preserved? Is that even possible? Let me explain to you what I mean. By what measurement, by what metrics could a committee even look at a project and say, we did a great job? Not only did we do a good job in the preservation, but the reason for preserving it has been justified. We can see the impact of this decision and all of this enormous amount of time and resource and energy. We can verify that this was a good choice and this was executed properly.
Okay, so I think that there are many errors that have taken place in preservation. Often those errors are related to choosing one period. Like many places have a long history. And if you just decide, well, I'm going to focus on this century and everything else is unimportant, you end up erasing layers of history. So that's one thing that international charters of preservation will tell you you shouldn't do, or you shouldn't whitewash history. But I would say oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, sometimes there's a kind of conflict between, shall we focus on something, a monument, for example, a castle or a city wall, and ignore buildings built around it and wipe them away, so we just expose the more monumental thing. And in cases where people haven't done that and they thought, well, actually, the monument is important, but the small houses around it are also important because they tell a story, you realize that with time, you're actually preserving much more. You're preserving the character and the identity of a place. Because if you only preserve the most magnificent things in it, you isolate those things from the society that created them. So, for example, in the former Soviet Union, there were examples that I can think of where they preserved the most important buildings really well, but they weren't as interested in the houses that people lived in, the markets, etc. And so, while the magnificent remained, it remained in a kind of sterile, lifeless way. Whereas when you go to a historic place and you think, oh, look, people are still using this market. They're still trading here as they have for 1,000 years. They're still selling vegetables or still making perfumes or dyeing fabric, or like in Morocco. You realize that not only have you preserved the physical aspects of a place, but you've also preserved the life and encouraged the life to continue. So you haven't ripped away people from their history and their historic building. So I would say that that's one way that you could sit back and think, actually, we did a good job.
I mean, if I take a look at, I'm sitting here in Beirut right now. If you take a look at Solidaire, right? Mm-hmm. At first glance, one might say, oh, this looks like it did before the war, but it's essentially a completely unoccupied place. Would that qualify what happened during the Solidaire project? By what are the things that would disqualify that as being a preservation project?
I mean, without wanting to kind of speak badly of Solidaire, I think that preservation projects require an appreciation that you should try to preserve something of what exists, not rebuild or not build something that looks as if it was old. I think that's the difference. That with preservation, you say, well, actually, we want to keep this wall or we want to keep this street. It tells us something. With urban development, you can think, well, we like the spirit of the old thing, but we're going to do it in a new way, and it's going to be much more lavish and grander. And so I would say that, but I also think that it's a scale, that it isn't just one is bad and the other is good. I think that one has to also look at it in a more nuanced way and think many projects can have good things and also shortcomings.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the Burda Festival. This is the Burda Festival podcast. I'm curious what your experience was like at the festival, and what does a festival like that is focused on arts and culture across the Islamic world offer as an opportunity for folks who are working across all different spectra and different areas of interest, but focus on arts and culture across the Arab world?
Well, I think one thing that was interesting and enjoyable about the Burda Festival is that it combined historic and traditional aspects of Islamic art and culture, like calligraphy, but also the more contemporary aspects. And I think that that's important, that it's not just about revering the past, but it's also about thinking, how does the past inform our contemporary identity in a modern way? And one example which I liked very much was there was a typography exhibition of students from Sharjah University, where they had taken the same text and the different members of the class had drawn it. In a modern way, the fonts were modern, but they were inspired by a very long tradition. And I think that's important. There were also workshops. I attended one by someone who I admire greatly, Imran Qureshi, who's a miniature artist from Pakistan. And he's a good example of someone who, having studied a very long and venerable tradition, expresses it and uses it in a contemporary way to capture contemporary society. And I think that's key, and it's important to realize that you can value your traditions, but it doesn't mean that you have to aspire to live or to produce what was produced in the 10th century, the 11th century, that you can produce new things that are linked to the past.
Are there any projects that you're hoping to work on over the next couple of years? Either projects that the wheels have already started turning, or projects that are totally out of left field. You think this would be a dream project to work on. No basis for dreaming, but this would be a dream project.
Well, actually, fortunately, we managed to get a grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund in the UK, because we're a UK charity, to give smaller grants to collections in Britain of Islamic art to enable them to use those collections to engage with a general audience and to make it an entry point into the discovery of the cultures of the Islamic world through art objects. And that's really exciting for us because we think that, part of what we aim to do and what we do is raise awareness. And we think that linking specialists to general audiences of young people, of older people, of teenagers, and enabling them to discover areas of the world and cultures that they might not know is a really wonderful thing. I would also say that it's also to enable people with links to the Islamic world to discover their own culture, because I think that sometimes people know about aspects of their culture or their faith, but they don't know about its art and its architecture and its literature. And I think that it's important to understand the past and to understand that actually it was multicultural, it was diverse. We talk about the Islamic world, but we talk about it in a very pluralistic sense, that a person perhaps painting icons in Istanbul is as relevant as the person making lattice screens for a mosque. And I think that, this kind of project that we're working on, and we're just about to start actually, in a way, wants to present the different complexities and the different ideas that produce the art of the Islamic world.
Amazing. Somehow you didn't offer me any specific dream projects. I was hoping you would say this particular neighborhood or this street or this site, but maybe that showcases my ignorance.
No. There are many dream projects, and one of the things that we hope to do more and more is to link crafts with preservation, because without, for example, if you have 100 old houses in the historic part of Jeddah, for example, which you just come back from, but you don't have the skills to recreate the wood or redo the carving, then it's very hard to preserve them in the future. And I think that increasingly we dream of being an organization that can create more bridges between, say, the preservers of old buildings and the people who have inherited skills from one generation to the next, and to ensure that those skills continue into the future.
What do we, maybe there's a good question to end on, and you've alluded to pieces of it, but I'll ask it outright. As a society, both local, regional, and global society, what do we stand to lose if we don't emphasize and invest in preservation? Also, what are the consequences of an increased emphasis on preservation?
Well, I think not preserving, you lose your identity, you lose the sense of who you are. And actually, I'll give you a response that's related to a project that we're supporting in Gaza and Palestine, which is to preserve an old commercial building, the gold market. The person that we gave the grant to, Munir Al-Baz, said that actually for people, when people think of Gaza, and when people think, even people from Gaza, young people, children, they don't think of it as having history and of being a thriving place. They think of it only in the context of what's happening today, that it's politically volatile, that they're suffocated, they can't leave, no one can come in. And so when you showcase the past, you remind people that actually they have an identity worth being proud of, that they should celebrate the fact that they're from a place that today might be difficult and might be challenging and might be undesirable in some way. So I would say that in not preserving, you rob people of the ability to feel pride in their identity. There is a danger in trying to preserve in a very conservative way of seeing that you can't add a new color or you can't change a window because it was always that way. And I think that the key to preservation is some sort of flexibility. That if you tell people, oh, I'm sorry, you can't have hot water in your house because it didn't exist in the 16th century, ultimately you're shooting yourself in the foot. So not preserving is bad, but not enabling people to live and have internet and have the modern conveniences in a way is equally bad.
I'm going to tack on one extra question.
Okay.
Because we're talking about identity, there's always a risk of, whenever we talk about the risk of losing one's identity, and creating a coordinated effort to maintain a specific identity, there's always a risk of losing the nuances of multiple identities, right, in a specific place. The multiplicity of variations in identity, and there's always a risk that process gets co-opted by specific movements, right? How do you navigate that as both a professional but also as an organization? How do you make sure that this identity rebuilding or building does not get co-opted and sort of distilled into a very present day political movement?
Okay, so I think that actually the more you look at history, the more you realize that our identities have always been fluid. And so the way that we try to do that as an organization is to recognize that in the projects that we support, we should celebrate the ones that showcase multiple identities, because often these constructs of identity is that, oh, we're only one thing, or we're more this than that. But actually, if you look, historic objects are a fascinating way of challenging that notion and reminding you that even 1,000 years ago, when travel was much harder and connectivity was harder, people were still exchanging ideas, absorbing ideas, and celebrating ideas. And as an organization, our view of what Islamic culture is a very broad and embracing one. And I think that's very important. As a professional, the same. I've worked on many, many different types of projects, different types of buildings. And I think that they're all important to me. Even if I know more about the artistic output of some cultures, it doesn't mean, that those that I know less about or come from a world that doesn't link to me or less important.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you were to leave the listeners with some parting recommendations of things that they should check out, heritage sites that should be on their list of things to check out, what are your top 3 places for folks to check out, either online, given COVID travel things, or if they're able to actually go and experience them in person?
Okay. Well, I would say use the opportunity of the digital world to discover something about history and heritage. And I think there are we have online resources about different aspects of Islamic art, but I would encourage people just to think, well, every museum, every heritage site probably has some kind of online output. Engage with it. And I would say, secondly, most places in which we live in have a history, even places that we think are new. So I know places like Dubai, which we think are synonymous with being new and modern, they also have a history of being an old port. And I think my parting advice is spend just a few hours discovering the history of the place in which you live, and you'll find that it exists. It's interesting. It's more fascinating than you ever imagined.
Fantastic. Well, Saif, thanks so much for doing the work that you do. Everyone can look up the Barakat Trust at barakat.org. And as always, go over to burda.ae for more information about the festival and about this podcast series.
Thank you very much for your challenging questions. You really made me think.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for listening. I hope to see you at the festival. For more information, go to burda.ae. That is burda.ae. The festival runs from December 19th to the 21st at the Dubai Exhibition Center as part of Expo 2020 Dubai. The festival is organized by the Ministry of Culture and Youth, UAE, and this podcast is powered by Afikra Podcasts. Take care.